Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to a flip that we're getting into after we spent several days talking about art, right? And leave me alone. I don't even care. I'll talk about art all I want, right? So, I'll talk about art all I want because it is a direct reflection of the stuff that's going on in Europe during the early 1800s, right? It's a direct reflection of the crazy industrial movement that's occurring. It's an intense reflection of the very, very passionate moments of the failure and the Enlightenment. And we're now moving into a period of reforms and revolutions. Now, the thing that's going to bother you the most is that I'm about to clip in an old flip from last year to use here, just because it was a really solid one that I used last year, because it's full of really, really good information. And then also on top of the fact as well is that I have to go ref here in a little bit, so I got to make sure I can get all these things uploaded. And then also everything else included with that is that I got to actually take this computer to get service because my battery is flipping out, so I can't actually record super long flips without this thing dying. Now, so the biggest thing about it though is we're getting into a period of extreme reform and revolution after, we took a couple days to talk about Byronic heroes and Abigail Winningham and Sam Johnson yelled at each other. But the biggest thing that I will tell you about this whole thing is that definitely try to find The Count of Monte Cristo, the film, on the streaming service if you want to. I can actually try to look it up really quick and see if it's on anything for you. But we're now going to be moving into a period of extreme reform and revolution that's going to be going on throughout most of Europe, and it's going to be a direct reaction, and it's going to be in a period of about 18 years, right? So you're going to be seeing a very, very, very intense thing happening that's going to directly lead to some chaotic moments throughout all of European history, including simultaneous revolutions as well as many other things, right? So we're leading into this thing known as the Battle of Ideologies, right? So we're seeing conservatism versus liberalism versus nationalism versus the radicals, right? So we're seeing the radicals show up who are these Democrats, socialists, communists, and all this other stuff. But the big things that we're going to be going over are several different topics in this flip. We're going over the liberation of Greece. We're going over the nationalism movements that are going to actually be happening in the liberation of Greece, leading into the unification movements throughout Europe that are going to be coming up soon. We're talking about liberal reform in Great Britain, where we're talking about the history of the Peterloo, and we're also going to be then finishing up with the Irish potato blight, right? So we're going to be talking about that in this flip, but I'm going to go ahead and whip it on over to myself from last year. But y'all crushed this thing. I'm very proud of you. You keep up the great work. I'll see y'all soon. Bright and early. It's about 7:15 right now. Trying to bang this thing out for y'all. And luckily, this is not going to be that long of a flip. All right, we can actually get a chance to kind of dive not super deep into this stuff. I don't take a lot of time with it. But I'm kind of just trying to show you that post-industrial revolution, or first wave of industrialism, right? Post-first wave of industrialism in Great Britain, post-Congress of Vienna, post-Romanticism, post-everybody reacting, everything's starting to kind of bubble up now, right? You've got a lot of situations where Metternich's version of conservatism is not always going to win, right? And you're going to start to see the signs in the tea leaves, right? We're going to start reading the tea leaves and seeing that this idea of suppressing liberal and socialist agenda post-1815 is going to be pretty much impossible, right? And that's what we spent that little bit of time in class talking about with this stuff, right? So from 1830 to about 1848, give or take, you're going to see the battle of the ideologies, right? Conservatism and liberalism and nationalism and the radicals, like the Democrats and the socialists and stuff like that, are going to start battling with one another in one form or another, right? And mostly it's conservatives versus everybody, but then ironically enough, these people versus each other, right? So they're not going to be able to agree on things. It's going to be very aggressive. And then also we're going to go over a few different topics. We're going to talk about the liberation of Greece. We're going to talk about liberal reform in Britain. We're going to talk about the Irish potato blight. We're going to talk about those three today. And then in class, and in one last flip, we're going to talk about these two, right? And it's not going to be very, very difficult. And it's just we're kind of wrapping up the fact that political things are just getting kind of hasty and intense right now, right? And I'm skipping those two slides. You don't need those, okay? So look at this right here. This is the Ottoman Empire from about its height in 1699 going to its fall in 1923, right? Now, by this point, the Ottomans did not really own this area right here. As you can see, it was retreating backwards and things like that. So they actually were much more focused in this area right here and Turkey, right? The Balkans and the Turkey, okay? And just to give you a heads up, this is the Balkans, right? So the big thing, though, is remember when conservatives came around under Metternich and the big goal early on was to crush any socialist or liberal ideas during this entire foray into politics and into the growth of the isms post-1815, people like Metternich would come in with the Quadruple Alliance or the Holy Alliance and just suppress any popular uprising, right? Well, the thing about it is, finally, we're getting into the Greeks, right? The Greeks are going to come up, and they're going to try to liberate themselves from the Ottomans, right? And this is going to be nationalism in action. We're going to see, for once, this idea of extreme pride in your cultural group, the genius that is involved in your people, is going to have its first devout, very intense action with the Greeks under the Ottoman rule. Now, Metternich, Clemens von Metternich, of course, when all of this begins, is going to originally support who? If we've got the Greeks right here, right, and then we have the Turks right there, who do you think that they're going to support originally? Metternich supports the Turks. All right, so why would Metternich support the Turks instead of the Greeks? Let's think about this for a second. The Turks they're not Christian, right? They're actually a conservative Muslim empire. They are not, they're not continental European by all considerations, and they're not historically considered a part of the European culture. Why would Metternich support the Turks rather than the Greeks? Well, it all has to do with the fact that they are conservative. They're conservative, okay? So the problem is that this cause is going to grow, right? And the Greeks are going to start demanding their growth away from the Ottomans. And they're going to start demanding their wants and their needs and their different ideologies, right? And this is all occurring in the 1820s, right? So this is going from about 1821 to about 1829, and by 1830 it'll be all wrapped up, right? Now, the cause, though, does become an intensely romantic one, right? So you've got British, French, Russian elites that are going to listen to their people who take up this romantic ideology that the Greeks, because of all their passion and veracity and their culture and their livelihood and their songs and their music and their diet and their everything else, deserve to be a free country, right? They deserve to be a self-determined, independent nation, okay? And it gets so intense that you saw romantic individuals joining up with it. You saw people from Britain and Russia and France, elites and former aristocrats, going to Greece to help the Greeks fight against the Ottoman Turks in this uprising, right? And one of them, most famously, was Lord Byron, who tragically died while he was there, right? That is how Lord Byron died, was trying to liberate Greece. And of course, look at Lord Byron right here, right? He's got to go out all romantic and just stoic and just dying for the passion of other people, right? Byronic hero. And then also, if you notice, the blanket is covering his club foot right here. Now, but the big thing, though, is that Greece is going to successfully liberate itself, right? And this is going to be after a civil war, too, and this is going to happen mostly, and it's going to be completely fixated and wrapped up by 1830. Technically, it was September 1829. Now, nationalism gets a win, and liberals got a win, and socialists got a win, and these groups of people finally united against a common enemy, and they pushed them out, right? And you saw the Greeks liberate themselves from the Turks. So Metternich's idea of a stranglehold, a conservative stranglehold on Europe, is starting to show cracks. It's starting to turn into like the Dutch boy in the dam. You see what I'm talking about? That's Metternich right there, right? He's trying to plug all those holes up as fast as he can before everything begins to leak, right? Because you've got Lord Byron getting involved in big things right now. And you've also even got very, very progressive liberal reform that's going to occur in, of all places, Great Britain. Now, when we discuss the Industrial Revolution, a lot of y'all were probably sitting there thinking, man, out of all of them, it seems like that Great Britain is the most liberal and classically liberal area in all of Europe, right? And the sad thing is you would be sort of right, okay? But by modern day standards, Great Britain would still be considered excessively conservative, all right? So were they liberal for the era? Yes. But was much liberalism seen in any country anywhere else? No, right? So when we're discussing Prussia, they still have an absolute ruler, or a person who believes he's an absolute ruler. When we discuss Austria, they still have a monarchy. When we discuss France, by this point, they still have a monarchy, right? They literally brought back Louis XIV's nephew, or Louis XVI's nephew, and he becomes Louis XVIII. I know y'all are like, what about the 17th? Well, that's Louis XVI's son that was only technically king for a little while, and he was 9. And then he died. They're going to bring him back. So all the rest of the continent is intensely conservative and holding on to these old school absolutist ideals, whereas Great Britain is slightly more liberal than everybody, but it's kind of like a phony liberalism by modern day standards because everything's not a fairy tale. It's not all perfect and great and smokestacks and factories and hooray, because you've got child labor, like blowing up everywhere. You got all these problems, right? And also, the people don't have much representation, okay? Now, this is a big issue because everything's not a fairy tale. It actually looks a lot more grim, if you know what I mean. All right, so now anyway, so really quick, there's going to be massive problems going on in Great Britain, and we're going to see a massive wave of liberal reform, right? Now, problems include, one, the landowning aristocracy is still very much in power, right? So the landowning aristocracy, the former nobles, that top of that triangle we talked about, is still very much in power. They hold most of the parliamentarian seats. They are the ones who are allowed to vote in large mass. They are the ones that are allowed to politically organize, right? They're also the ones that pass those things like the Combination Acts, right? To try and prevent workers' organizations. And then had to repeal them later on in the 1820s when they realized that none of this is going to be effective and people are still going to go on strike and you're not going to stop them, right? So, think about those things that we talked about towards the latter half of the Industrial Revolution, right? The landowning aristocracy that is inside the parliament that was able to push these really aggressive, really stupid laws was actually able to do it efficiently because they were the only ones allowed to be elected to parliament, or the ones that could actually be elected to parliament because they didn't have business contracts, factory ownership, or working to worry about, right? These landowning aristocrats have always been the ones in power in Great Britain. It's just like the new version of the nobility. Now they're just in the parliament, right? So now some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, what about the glorious revolution under William and Mary? Well, okay, you're getting a little bit much right now because the nobles at the time and the landowning aristocracy were still the ones that shoved James II out of town, right? So there is still no middle class representation. There is definitely no poor representation. And urbanization from the Industrial Revolution is leading to a massive amount of interaction more so than ever before. We now have class-conscious individuals walking around the society in London, right? The king is also going to manipulate the parliament. He's going to specifically decide who can and cannot vote, and he's going to try his best to make sure that it stays in the house of the landowning aristocracy. He doesn't want to make, the king at the time, who is Victoria, Queen. Okay, it's not her yet. She doesn't take over until 1837. But who is she succeeded by? Or proceeded by. So Queen Victoria, the king at the time, during this stuff right here, is known as, that's not hard, William IV. All right, so William IV, who is of the House of Hanover. I believe he's the House of Hanover. He's not Windsor. Yeah, he's a Hanover. Nice. All right, so now look. So William IV is going to be the king at the time, and he wants to prevent all these middle-class people from voting, right? He wants to keep it this way because it keeps things wealthy in the aristocrats' pockets, and if the aristocrats are happy, as we know in Great British history, then the king is happy, right? So there's a lot of manipulation going on. Now, why, though, are all these issues occurring? Why do the landowning aristocrats want to stay in power? Why do they want to prevent people from voting? What is their motive behind it? Well, first of all, the French Revolution scared the ever-loving daylights out of British aristocrats, right? It scared the daylights out of them. They didn't like the idea that middle-class people could now stand up for themselves and own property and then possibly end up making more money than them, right? So that's a very scary thing for them because remember, you're now seeing a battle of two sides, right? You're really seeing a battle of two groups because if you really, really look at it, right, you had the upper class inside of the Industrial Revolution, right? Okay, I'm going to put let's not do that. If you really look at it this way, you've got a big conflict of ideologies inside of Great Britain. You've got the upper class right here, and you got the middle class right here. Now, how does each of these groups make large sums of money, right? So the upper class got their money from the enclosure movement, right? So when the enclosure movement occurred, the upper class was making tons of money. But now, with the Industrial Revolution, the middle class is making an excessive amount of money because they're opening factories and they're putting these things after the advent of the steam engine in the 1760s. They're now putting their factories anywhere and everywhere, in cities, other places, stuff like that. So we've got this situation where we have two groups that are kind of coming head to head, right? So they're coming head to head, and like one side is saying, look, I want more power in my own government, right? And then the other side is saying, look, no, right? So the big thing about it is they're going to try and keep things this way. The upperclassmen want to keep it like this, and they want to make these people irrelevant, right? So a big example of some strife that's going to go on, and some upper class pushback and some upper class aggressiveness is going to be these things known as the Corn Laws, right? Now, really quickly, when we're discussing the Corn Laws, I myself, up until a couple years ago, would always look at this and be like, is this about corn? This is another British slang problem, okay? Corn in Great Britain can be used to refer to any grain, all right? Any grain whatsoever. So you need to understand that real fast, okay? So corn in Great Britain is used to refer to any grain, including wheat, barley, oats, anything, right? So it's not like they're just bringing in ears of corn from Russia when I get to this here in a second. But with the Corn Laws, you have to understand this was a aristocratic move to keep themselves very fat, very happy, very entertained. So, during the Napoleonic War years, the British aristocrats were making tons of cash, right? Lots of money. Some of you are saying, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, how would it be possible that British aristocrats are making tons of money during a time that's just eviscerating the continent, right? It's a great question. Very good question, Marie Rowley. Now look, mainly because cheap grains from Eastern Europe were in short supply, okay? So leading up to 1815, you had the Russian invasion, right, in 1812. You had the Napoleonic Wars that was destroying entire swaths of wheat fields that were being usually shipped into Great Britain at a cheaper price. So it was making the cost of bread go down, which was helping out the poor and helping out the middle class, especially during their Industrial Revolution and the urbanization of cities, right? So mainly, though, these cheap grains were coming in from Eastern Europe. So when the Napoleonic Wars break out from 1803 to 1812, you're going to see a massive downshift in the importation of grains because of a low supply, right? You got Napoleon walking around in fields burning stuff to the ground, and then you got the Russians burning stuff and running the other way with scorched earth. So cheap grains became in short supply. This forced the poor and the middle class to buy very expensive, enclosure-based British grains, right? So, and the British aristocrats are getting really fat and happy, like I just showed you, being like, and getting really excited because they're making tons of money off of the Napoleonic Wars. And some of people could actually take this idea and kind of extrapolate it over the coronavirus pandemic because billionaires are getting richer during a time of chaos. You know what I mean? Like so, and that's just true. Now look, 1815, Napoleon is now gone, which means cheap grain can come back, right? It only will take about a year to get a good harvest in, and then you'll be able to flood the British market with cheap grains again, and the poor and the middle class will be able to have a cheaper cost of bread. Carson's like, yes, let's go, right? So, yay, bread. Now, the other thing that you need to understand is that is when the Corn Laws come into play, okay? The parliament that is locked down by an 8% voting class and a bunch of aristocrats passed this idea called the Corn Laws, right? And the Corn Laws of 1815 said the parliament, let me rephrase, back it up. The Corn Laws were ran through Parliament by conservatives saying that foreign grain could only be imported in times of desperate need, right? So this is a play by British aristocrats to just keep making the same money they were making during a time of war. And it's also disgustingly selfish because this is probably one of the one times in European history that I can point to and be like, that's rich people trying to stay rich for their own gain, and it's so selfish, and look at the, it is so bad, right? And they're doing this so they can basically just keep making more money. And this is going to infuriate the middle class and the working poor because it's keeping their most basic dietary staple very expensive, right? And actually, a very famous writer is going to create a villain based off of the Corn Laws and also based off the economic tension that was occurring in Great Britain. And that was going to be Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Ebenezer Scrooge actually made an excessive amount of his money doing two things: money lending and also selling grains in the Corn Laws, right? Scrooge was one of the landowning aristocrats. He was one of the intense figures that was super wealthy, and all he cared about is his money, right? And so the Christmas Carol was actually modeled off of a villain that at the time was considered one of these guys that made all of his money off these Corn Laws, right? So then you're going to see, and also Charles Dickens was actually a part of this group called the Anti-Corn Law League, right? So like now, anyway, now then you're going to see a very major event happen, right? And this event is going to be known as the Massacre of Peterloo in 1817. Because there's this thing you got to understand about the British Parliament. It was ran mostly predominantly in the House of Commons, was controlled by this political party known as the Tories, right? Now, the Tories still exist today, all right? The Tories are the modern era conservative party, right? Now, at the time, they weren't 100% conservative. It was kind of like they were conservative with a little liberal, like a dash of liberal, right? So now they were faced with huge protests because of these Corn Laws. Then to follow the Corn Laws and to stop the protests, you would think that they would be like, okay, it was our bad. We're sorry. We're going to take Corn Laws away. No! What they did is they then passed things like the Six Acts, which eliminated habeas corpus, which is your right to a fair trial, eliminated free speech, and eliminated your right to freedom of assembly, right? So, good God, the landed aristocracy of Great Britain is literally just doing whatever they want and stripping people's rights away. So very Hobbesian dystopia going on right now. And what's going to happen at this place called Peterloo, not Peterloo actually, at St. Peter's Field, which is a very large field and like park area, and I believe it's inside Manchester, but I'm not positive. All right, so I'll double check on that. But at this huge field, it was going to, like at St. Peter's Field, St. Peter's Square, what's going to end up happening is a huge protest is going to show up. An organized, very peaceful protest is going to arrive, and it's going to have 60,000 people in it. 60,000 people descended upon Manchester, United Kingdom, which is north of London, right, at this massive field known as St. Peter's Field, and they showed up demanding certain things. Now look at this picture. What do they have on top of the sticks? The red caps of the revolution. Oh, liberal, like conservatives in Great Britain are freaking out. This is their worst nightmare. And they're demanding fair, free markets, right? They want fair, free grains that be imported from foreign destinations if they are cheaper. They want universal suffrage. They want more voting rights. They want better, they want no combination prevention laws. They are furious. They are standing up for their liberty and their rights. And it was being organized by this guy right here in the middle, by the last name Hunt, right? I can't remember what his first name is for the life of me, but he was one of the biggest organizers, right? 60,000 people showed up. And because of this, the British government responded, and I need you to jot this down, responded by sending a massive cavalry unit into the protest. They literally rammed through the protest on horses, pulled their sabers, and began slashing at them to get them to leave, right? 18 people died. 400 people were injured, right? And the very first death at the Battle of Peterloo was a 2-year-old child. A 2-year-old child who got knocked out of his mother's hands when he was hit by a horse, and then the child was trampled to death, right? That is insane. This is literally the direct suppression of people's voices, right? And it is known as the Battle of Peterloo, right? Or the Massacre at Peterloo. And it's because it's alluding to Waterloo, right? Now, after this happens, the Parliament then kind of takes a step back and is like, wow, we can't do this anymore. We can't sit there and have people, we can't have 2-year-olds getting trampled. There were mothers that were killed, fathers with families that were killed. It was so bad. And they were killed in malicious ways. I think only one of the deaths was a constable, which is a cop. I think only one of the deaths was a cop, and it was because it was a retaliation killing the day after, right? And what ends up occurring, though, is the Tories and the Whigs is the other minority party in the Parliament, they end up meeting at the House of Commons. And a lot of them start to ask, are we conservative or are we liberal? And it turns out that they're both very conservative. but they're just liberal towards certain groups, right? The Tories want to be more liberal to the working class. The Whigs want to be more liberal to the middle class, right? So the new reforms are going to be adopted following the Massacre at Peterloo, like the Reform Bill of 1832, which is going to increase suffrage by 50%. Now, some of you are like, wait a minute, if only 8% of British people could vote, that means now only 12% of British people could vote. I know, I agree, it's not that great, but it's something, all right? So, but it is liberal reform, right? The Anti-Corn Law League, which had a member known as Charles Dickens in it, are going to show up, protest again, and have the corn laws repealed in 1846, allowing the influx and bring-in of cheap grains again, right? Then there's going to be the 10-Hour Act, right? The 10-Hour Act is going to be passed where women and children were not allowed to be forced to work over 10 hours, and that factories should adopt a 10-hour workday, right? We're seeing progressive things, but the one thing that was still not adopted was universal suffrage. That was one of the biggest demands, and they actually had a massive petition following Peterloo that went out that had thousands on thousands on thousands of signatures on it, and they resubmitted it every few years, and they still did not get universal suffrage until over 100 years later, right? So now, well, not over 100 years, but like several decades later. Now, also, and we'll bring this person up, which is very important, but notice we're in 1846, 1847, 1832. We're in like the 1840s right now, which is very important that we're progressing through history. Who is in charge of Great Britain now? So all of these things happened under William the IV, right? So this person is going to be born in 1819, and as she grows older, in 1837, she takes over as Queen Victoria, right? So that's right, Queen Victoria, the last Hanover queen, and considered one of the most intense queens in all of history. She is, yes, conservative, but she also brought Britain to economic dominance. So it's kind of like she's a very interesting figure that we will bring up a little bit more later. And Queen Victoria led a very, very intense life, got married to a guy named Prince Albert of the Saxe-Coburgs, who was a German man, and we will discuss how his whole family is going to play out. So, but we'll come back to them later. So just so you know, I put her in there just last night so you would know who's in charge of Great Britain by the end of this whole thing, right? And then, I'm sorry, I hate to do this to you, Morgan. I hate to do this to you, but we got to talk about it. Ireland, the Great Famine, and the Hungry 40s, right? We got to talk about potatoes going from this to this, right? So, extreme population growth in Ireland is a major cause of what was known as the Great Famine, or the Irish potato famine, right? It's a common event that most people walking around with some semblance of a historical knowledge know of, right? And the causes include extreme population growth, right? Like, so why was Ireland affected so harshly by this potato blight, right? Well, one, because their population had grown by double since 1725. And a lot of this has to do with the introduction of the crop of the potato to Ireland, right? So, and it was the common brown potato is the one that they were given to grow on their lands, right? And because of the introduction of this, you're going to see the population go from 3 million in 1725 to 8 million in 1840, right? That's a doubling of population, almost a tripling, okay? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that potatoes are very easy to farm, right? Very easy to farm, very, very full of calories, could feed a family very quickly, and it wasn't that difficult, right? 1 acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. And to just give you an understanding, an acre is about the size of the courtyard. Like, it's not that big, right? Like, so like an acre is not nearly as big as y'all think it is, right? So 1 acre could feed a family of 6 for a year. That's insane, right? But also, it's going to be caused, and the Great Famine is going to be so bad, because there's so much extreme poverty going on in Ireland, right? The Irish were specifically given the potato because it was easy to grow and because it was so cheap to sell. So the problem with this whole situation was you had a very large population with a crop that wasn't worth much money, right? So it kept them poor. There are statistics that said like 50% of Irish children did not own shoes, right? That like some huge percentage of Irish children did not own proper clothing. They wore potato sacks instead of actual shirts and clothes, right? And the other big problem with this is if you have Ireland pretty much universally farming potatoes, and then a disease known as the potato blight comes through and kills all these potatoes, you're going to see a ridiculous amount of famine, right? So, and the famine was going to be insane. And it's going to particularly affect Ireland so harsh because Irish people married young, because they never broke out of that old school 1700s agricultural, borderline Middle Ages lifestyle, right? They were given these potatoes to stay completely agrarian, and the Industrial Revolution did not really truly pop up in Ireland, except in maybe Dublin and Edinburgh, right? So only in these couple of cities, okay? Now, 1 acre could feed that family for a year, and then these Irish people were getting married and having several children to help farm as many potatoes as possible, to help with labor, and also because they are a devoutly Catholic country still, right? So the Great Famine is going to happen on and off again from 1845 to 1851, and it's going to lead to massive crop failures and mass immigration. 2.75 million people, 2.75 of this 8 million right here immigrated away, and 1.5 million of them died, right? So like Ireland had a huge die-off of people and also stillbirths, right? 1.5 million people were unborn, failed pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, and stuff like that, because the wives and the mothers did not have enough nutrients to keep the children inside of them healthy, right? So the Irish potato blight is insane. And so what we're going to get to soon is we're going to talk about how all this stuff is going to come flying together, and it's going to lead to revolutions that just break out all over the continent, all right? So I'll talk to you guys then.